My name is Emily Thompson. I'm 30 years old, and I just discovered that my sister Lauren splashed red paint all over the custom wedding dress I spent 5 months designing and $8,000 creating, just 4 days before my wedding ceremony. When I confronted my mother Barbara about Lauren's sabotage, expecting maternal support during one of the most devastating moments of my life, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "She only did it because of you, Emily. You know how your success affects her." What my family didn't know was that their defense of Lauren's jealous destruction was about to become a viral story that would bring me more support from strangers than I ever received from my own relatives, and consequences for Lauren that my mother spent a lifetime helping her avoid. I've spent the last 8 years building a successful interior design business in Portland, Oregon, creating custom spaces for clients who appreciate thoughtful aesthetics and functional beauty. My work has been featured in several design magazines. I've won regional awards for residential projects, and I've built a strong following on social media, where I share my design philosophy and completed projects. But more importantly, I met my fiancé Michael Patterson through my work when he hired me to redesign his architectural firm's offices, and we connected over our shared appreciation for clean lines, natural materials, and spaces that tell stories. The wedding I'd been planning for the past year was a reflection of everything Michael and I valued: intimate, elegant, meaningful, with every detail carefully considered and personally significant. We were having a small ceremony with 80 guests at a restored historic barn that we'd helped renovate specifically for events like this. I'd designed much of the decor myself, incorporating elements that represented our relationship and our aesthetic preferences. The color palette was sage green, cream, and gold, with natural wood accents and abundant greenery creating an organic, sophisticated atmosphere. But the centerpiece of the entire wedding, the element I'd invested the most time and emotion into, was my dress. As an interior designer, I understand the power of custom creation, of something made specifically for you that reflects your vision and personality, rather than just selecting something off a rack. I'd worked with a talented local seamstress named Patricia Montgomery for 5 months, having fittings every 2 weeks, refining details, adjusting the silhouette, perfecting every element until the dress was exactly what I'd envisioned. The gown was a masterpiece of subtle elegance: ivory silk crepe with a fitted bodice, a flowing A-line skirt, delicate cap sleeves, and hand-embroidered botanical details on the bodice that echoed the natural aesthetic of our wedding venue. Patricia had spent over 200 hours on the embroidery alone, creating intricate leaf and vine patterns that looked like they were growing organically across the fabric. The dress cost $8,000, which I'd saved specifically for this purpose, understanding that custom craftsmanship of this quality was an investment in something I'd treasure forever. 4 days before the wedding, I went to Patricia's studio for my final fitting and to bring the dress home. Everything was perfect. The fit was flawless. The embroidery was stunning. The way the silk moved was exactly what I'd hoped for. Patricia and I both had tears in our eyes as I stood in front of the mirror seeing the completed gown for the first time, understanding that this was the culmination of months of collaboration and creativity. I carefully transported the dress home in its protective garment bag, hung it in my bedroom closet where it would stay until the wedding morning, and went to meet Michael for dinner to celebrate reaching this milestone in our wedding preparations. We were both excited and slightly overwhelmed by how close the wedding was, discussing final details and looking forward to finally being married after a year of planning. When I returned home that evening around 9 o'clock, I found my sister Lauren sitting on my couch with an opened bottle of my wine, looking agitated and confrontational. Lauren had a key to my house that I'd given her years ago for emergencies, but she'd been using it increasingly often to show up uninvited, particularly when she was upset about something in her own life. "We need to talk," Lauren said as soon as I walked in, her voice carrying that edge of manufactured grievance that I'd learned to recognize over years of her creating conflicts when she felt I was getting too much positive attention. "I'm really hurt that you didn't ask me to give a speech at your wedding reception. I'm your sister, Emily. I should be honored somehow during your big day." I was exhausted from wedding preparations, and not in the mood for one of Lauren's dramatic conversations about feeling slighted by perfectly reasonable wedding decisions. "Lauren," I said, keeping my voice calm, "we're only having 2 speeches at the reception. Michael's best man and my maid of honor. We're keeping things simple and short so people can actually enjoy the party instead of sitting through lengthy toasts. It's nothing personal against you." But Lauren wasn't interested in reasonable explanations. "Nothing personal?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You asked Ashley Monroe to be your maid of honor even though you've only known her for 5 years. I'm your sister. I should be the one standing up there talking about you, not some friend you met at a design conference. Have you ever tried to explain to someone that their jealousy was creating problems that didn't actually exist?" The conversation that followed was typical of interactions with Lauren over the past decade. She would fixate on some perceived slight or exclusion, interpret my life choices as personal attacks against her, and create conflicts that forced me to defend decisions that had nothing to do with her. I explained that Ashley was my maid of honor because she'd been my closest friend and biggest supporter for years, that the speech arrangements weren't about ranking family importance, and that she was still invited to the wedding as a cherished guest and sister. But nothing I said made any difference. Lauren continued drinking my wine and complaining about how I always made her feel inferior, how my success was hard for her to watch, how my wedding was just another example of me showing off while she struggled. Finally, around 11 o'clock, I told her she needed to leave because I had early morning meetings with wedding vendors and couldn't stay up arguing about imaginary problems. Lauren left in a huff, slamming my door and leaving the wine bottle half empty on my coffee table. I was annoyed but not particularly concerned. This was standard behavior from Lauren whenever I had something good happening in my life. She would create drama, express hurt feelings about perceived slights, demand emotional labor from me to reassure her, and then eventually move on to the next grievance. It was exhausting, but it was familiar. What I didn't know was that before leaving my house that night, Lauren had gone into my bedroom, opened my closet, pulled my wedding dress out of its protective garment bag, and carried it to my garage where I kept painting supplies for my design work. She had opened a can of bright red acrylic paint, and she had systematically splashed it all over the bodice, the skirt, the delicate embroidered details that Patricia had spent months creating. Then she had hung the dress back in the garment bag, zipped it closed, and left my house with no one knowing what she'd done. I didn't discover the destruction until the next morning when I decided to look at the dress one more time before my busy day of final wedding preparations. I unzipped the garment bag expecting to see the beautiful ivory silk gown I'd fallen in love with the previous afternoon. Instead, I saw red paint splattered across every surface of the dress, soaked into the silk crepe, covering the hand-embroidered botanical details, completely destroying 5 months of work and $8,000 of custom craftsmanship. For several seconds, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain couldn't reconcile the beautiful dress I remembered with the paint-covered disaster in front of me. I pulled the dress out of the bag with shaking hands, hoping somehow that the damage wasn't as bad as it looked, that maybe the paint was just on the garment bag and not the actual dress. But as I examined it more closely, the full scope of the destruction became clear. The paint had soaked through the silk, staining it permanently. The embroidered details were covered and damaged beyond repair. The dress was completely unwearable and completely irreparable. I collapsed on my bedroom floor, holding the ruined dress, trying to understand how this could have happened. Had I somehow accidentally gotten paint on it when I brought it home? But that made no sense because I hadn't been anywhere near my painting supplies, and the dress had been in its protective bag the entire time. Had someone broken into my house? But nothing else was disturbed, and there was no evidence of forced entry. Then I remembered Lauren sitting on my couch the previous night, remembered her agitation and manufactured grievances, remembered how she'd had access to my house and my bedroom and my closet while I'd been out to dinner with Michael. And I knew with absolute certainty that my sister had destroyed my wedding dress out of jealous rage because I was getting married and she wasn't. Because I was having the beautiful wedding she'd always wanted for herself, because my life was working out in ways that made her feel inadequate by comparison. I called Lauren immediately, my hands shaking with rage and devastation. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice casual and unconcerned. "Did you do something to my wedding dress?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady but failing as emotion overwhelmed me. There was a pause, and then Lauren laughed. Actually laughed. You mean your precious custom designer dress that you've been bragging about for months? Yeah, I improved it. Added some color to your perfect little creation. The casual cruelty in her voice was shocking, even though I'd experienced years of Lauren's jealous behavior. Lauren, I said, my voice breaking, you destroyed my wedding dress 4 days before my wedding. Patricia spent 5 months making this dress. It cost $8,000. It can't be replaced in time. Why would you do this? Because you think you're so perfect with your perfect fiancé and your perfect wedding and your perfect dress, Lauren said, her voice becoming more angry and defensive. You parade your happiness in front of everyone while I'm still single and struggling. You don't care how your success makes other people feel. You just care about showing off and making yourself look good. I hung up on her, unable to listen to her justifications for destroying something irreplaceable. Then I called my mother Barbara, desperately needing parental support and expecting her to be as horrified as I was by what Lauren had done. Barbara had always made excuses for Lauren's behavior, but surely even she would understand that destroying someone's wedding dress was unconscionable and required serious consequences. My mother and sister Lauren have always had a complicated dynamic that I've never fully understood, but that has profoundly shaped my entire family's functioning for as long as I can remember. Barbara, my mother, is 55 years old and has spent my entire life treating Lauren's feelings as more important than anyone else's reality, creating a family culture where Lauren's emotional comfort took precedence over fairness, accountability, or reasonable boundaries. Growing up, Lauren was always described as sensitive and delicate, which were euphemisms for the fact that she would have explosive emotional reactions when things didn't go her way, or when other people received attention she felt entitled to. If I got good grades, Lauren would cry about how school was harder for her, and I was making her look bad by succeeding. If I made the cheerleading squad, Lauren would have a meltdown about how she didn't make it, and I was rubbing my success in her face. If I had friends over, Lauren would create some crisis that required everyone's attention to shift back to her. And through all of this, my mother Barbara's consistent response was to blame me for provoking Lauren by being successful, or happy, or simply existing in ways that made Lauren feel inadequate. Emily, you need to be more sensitive to your sister's feelings, Barbara would say whenever Lauren sabotaged something important to me. You know she struggles with confidence. Can't you just be a little less obvious about your achievements so she doesn't feel so bad about herself? The message was clear and consistent. My job was to manage Lauren's emotions by diminishing my own success, and if I failed to properly minimize myself, and Lauren reacted badly, her behavior was my fault for not being sufficiently self-effacing. It was a toxic family dynamic that taught me my accomplishments were problems to be hidden rather than achievements to be celebrated, and that Lauren's inability to handle other people's happiness was something everyone else needed to accommodate, rather than something she needed to work on. This pattern continued throughout high school and college. When I was accepted to my first-choice design school, Lauren crashed my celebration dinner by announcing she was dropping out of community college because, clearly, education is only for Emily. When I landed my first major design client, Lauren showed up at the installation and criticized my work in front of the client, nearly costing me the project. When I started dating Michael, Lauren tried to flirt with him at a family gathering, later claiming she was just testing whether he was good enough for Emily, when I confronted her about the inappropriate behavior. And through every incident, Barbara's response was identical. Emily, you need to understand that your success is hard for Lauren to watch. She only acts out because she feels inferior to you. If you were more sensitive to her struggles, she wouldn't feel the need to get your attention in negative ways. The victim blaming was so consistent and so comprehensive that I'd started to internalize it, wondering if maybe I was somehow responsible for Lauren's jealous sabotage, if maybe I should hide my achievements and minimize my happiness to prevent her destructive reactions. But therapy over the past few years had helped me understand that I wasn't responsible for managing my adult sister's emotions, and that Barbara's enabling of Lauren's behavior was preventing Lauren from developing normal coping skills and accountability. The wedding planning had been a particularly difficult period for family dynamics. Lauren had made multiple comments about how my wedding was over the top and showing off, despite the fact that it was a relatively modest celebration by most standards. She'd criticized my dress choice before even seeing it, saying custom gowns were pretentious and wasteful. She'd complained about not being included in every decision, even though she wasn't in the wedding party, and therefore had no role in planning details. Barbara had consistently defended Lauren's criticisms, suggesting that maybe I should scale back the wedding to be more considerate of Lauren's feelings about still being single. "Honey, I know you're excited about your wedding," Barbara had said during one particularly frustrating conversation, "but you need to remember that this is hard for Lauren to watch. She always thought she'd be married before you, and seeing you plan this beautiful wedding is really painful for her. Maybe you could be a little less enthusiastic about the details when she's around." The suggestion that I should hide my excitement about my own wedding to protect my 27-year-old sister's feelings about being single was so absurd that I'd actually laughed. But Barbara was serious, genuinely believing that my job was to manage Lauren's emotional responses to my life events by minimizing my own joy and success. Have you ever realized that someone you loved expected you to make yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger? When I called Barbara the morning I discovered the destroyed dress, I was still hoping that surely this level of sabotage would break through her denial and force her to acknowledge that Lauren's behavior had crossed a line that couldn't be excused or explained away. Surely destroying someone's custom wedding dress 4 days before their wedding was serious enough to warrant consequences and accountability. "Mom," I said when she answered, my voice shaking with tears and rage. "Lauren destroyed my wedding dress. She used a key I gave her for emergencies to come into my house, went into my bedroom, pulled my dress out of my closet, and covered it with red paint. The dress is completely ruined. Patricia can't fix it. There's no time to make a replacement. My wedding is in 4 days and I don't have a dress because Lauren destroyed it out of jealous rage." I expected shock, horror, an immediate apology on Lauren's behalf, promises that there would be consequences, offers to help me figure out what to do. Instead, there was a long silence, and then Barbara said the words that would define our relationship for the rest of our lives. "She only did it because of you, Emily." I was so shocked by her response that I couldn't initially form words. "What?" I finally managed. "Lauren only destroyed your dress because of how you've been behaving about this wedding," Barbara said, her voice taking on the defensive tone she always used when protecting Lauren from accountability. "You've been parading your happiness in front of her for months, talking constantly about your custom dress and your perfect venue and your wonderful fiancé. You know she's sensitive about still being single. You should have been more considerate of her feelings instead of rubbing your success in her face." The victim blaming was so extreme and so outrageous that I actually started laughing, a harsh sound that had nothing to do with humor. "Mom," I said, "Lauren committed a crime. She destroyed $8,000 worth of property that can't be replaced. She sabotaged my wedding 4 days before the ceremony. And you're telling me it's my fault because I was too happy about getting married?" "I'm saying that you provoked her," Barbara replied. "You know how your success affects Lauren. If you had been more sensitive to her situation, she wouldn't have felt the need to get your attention this way. You're always so focused on your own happiness that you don't think about how your choices impact other people." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Barbara making excuse after excuse for Lauren's behavior, while simultaneously blaming me for causing the destruction by being insufficiently apologetic about my own success. She suggested that maybe the dress being ruined was a sign that I should have a simpler wedding. She said that Lauren was going through a difficult time, and I needed to be more understanding of her struggles. She even suggested that I should consider postponing the wedding until Lauren was in a better place emotionally to handle attending. Not once did Barbara acknowledge that what Lauren had done was wrong, destructive, criminal, or required consequences. Not once did she apologize for her daughter's behavior or offer to help me solve the crisis Lauren had created. Her entire focus was on justifying Lauren's actions and blaming me for failing to prevent them by properly managing my sister's jealous feelings. When I hung up the phone with my mother, I sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by the ruined dress and realized with devastating clarity that my family would never hold Lauren accountable for her destructive behavior, that Barbara would always blame me for provoking Lauren by existing successfully, and that I would never receive the maternal support and protection that should have been my right as a daughter. I also realized that if I hid what Lauren had done and quietly solved the dress crisis myself, I would be enabling the same toxic dynamic that had defined our family for decades. I would be protecting Lauren from the natural consequences of her actions, allowing Barbara to continue her victim-blaming narrative, and teaching Lauren that she could destroy my important moments without facing any real repercussions. For 30 years, I'd been expected to make myself smaller to accommodate Lauren's inability to handle other people's success. For 30 years, I'd been blamed for her jealous reactions to my achievements. For 30 years, I'd protected the family's image by hiding Lauren's sabotage and Barbara's enabling from the outside world. But I was done protecting people who refused to protect me. I was done hiding destructive behavior to preserve a family peace that only existed because I'd agreed to diminish myself. I was done enabling a dynamic that would continue for the rest of my life unless I finally established consequences that Barbara refused to impose. I decided that if my family wouldn't hold Lauren accountable for destroying my wedding dress, maybe public exposure would create the consequences they were unwilling to establish. Maybe if Lauren's actions became public knowledge instead of another hidden family secret, she would finally face social repercussions that might actually change her behavior. Maybe if Barbara's enabling became visible to our community, she would understand that defending destructive behavior had its own costs. I texted my maid of honor, Ashley Monroe, and asked her to come over immediately. When Ashley arrived 30 minutes later and saw the destroyed dress, she was horrified and furious in all the ways my mother should have been but wasn't. "Emily," Ashley said, examining the paint-covered silk with tears in her eyes, "this is criminal destruction of property. You need to call the police and file a report. Lauren can't get away with this." I explained my conversation with Barbara, the decades of victim-blaming and excuse-making, the pattern of Lauren sabotaging my important moments while my mother defended her behavior. Ashley listened with growing anger, occasionally interjecting with observations about how dysfunctional and toxic my family dynamics were. "You've been protecting them by keeping this private," Ashley finally said. "You've been hiding Lauren's behavior and Barbara's enabling because you didn't want to embarrass them or create family conflict. But they're not protecting you, Emily. They're sacrificing you to preserve Lauren's ego and Barbara's denial. Maybe it's time to stop hiding their dysfunction and let them face the natural consequences of their actions." Ashley's words crystallized what I'd been thinking since hanging up with my mother. I was done being the family member whose job was to absorb abuse quietly to maintain everyone else's comfort. I was done protecting people who refused to protect me. I was done enabling a toxic dynamic by hiding its effects from the world. "I want you to post about this on social media," I told Ashley. "I want you to tell the story of what happened, include photos of the destroyed dress, explain that we're postponing the wedding because my sister sabotaged it out of jealousy, and my mother defended her actions. I want everyone who knows our family to understand what Lauren did and how Barbara responded." Ashley looked at me carefully, making sure I understood what I was proposing. "Emily," she said, "if I post this, it's going to blow up. Your family is going to be furious. People you know are going to see this and judge them. There's no taking it back once it's public. Are you sure you want to do this?" I looked at my destroyed wedding dress, thought about my mother's victim blaming, remembered decades of being told my success was something to hide rather than celebrate. "I'm sure," I said. "I'm done protecting people who hurt me and then blame me for being hurt. Let them face the consequences of their own actions for once." Ashley took detailed photos of the dress from multiple angles, capturing the extent of the paint damage and the ruined embroidery. She interviewed me about the timeline of events, Lauren's admission that she'd destroyed the dress, and Barbara's response that it was my fault for being too happy about my wedding. Then she sat down to write a post that would change everything about how my family's dysfunction was perceived by our community. The post that Ashley created was carefully worded to be factual and emotional without being melodramatic or exaggerated. She explained that I was her best friend, that she was my maid of honor, and that she was sharing this story with my permission because I needed support during an impossible situation. She described my custom dress, the 5 months Patricia had spent creating it, the hand-embroidered details that made it unique and irreplaceable. She posted photos showing the beautiful ivory silk covered in red paint, the ruined embroidery, the destroyed craftsmanship, She explained that my sister had admitted to the destruction, that my mother had defended her by saying it was my fault, and that we were now postponing the wedding because finding a replacement dress in 4 days was impossible. But the most powerful part of the post was Ashley's direct address to the topic of family toxicity and jealous sabotage. She wrote about how some family members can't handle other people's happiness, how jealousy can lead people to destroy rather than celebrate, and how enabling this behavior only makes it worse. She wrote about the importance of holding people accountable even when they're family, and about how sometimes the healthiest choice is exposure rather than protection when dealing with destructive relatives. The post concluded with an explanation that we were working on a solution to the dress crisis, but that the wedding would definitely be postponed because I deserved to have my dream day without it being overshadowed by my sister's sabotage and my mother's victim blaming. Ashley included my Venmo handle for anyone who wanted to contribute to replacing the dress, though she emphasized that what I really needed was emotional support and validation, that I wasn't crazy for being devastated by what my family had done. Have you ever made a decision to stop hiding family dysfunction and braced yourself for the consequences of telling the truth? Ashley posted the story on her personal social media accounts at 3 p.m. Within an hour, it had been shared 50 times. Within 3 hours, it had been shared 500 times. By evening, the post was viral, with thousands of shares, tens of thousands of comments, and widespread outrage about Lauren's destructive jealousy and Barbara's enabling response. But what happened next went beyond anything either Ashley or I could have anticipated. Among the thousands of people sharing and commenting on the post was someone whose attention would transform my wedding crisis into an extraordinary story about community support, overcoming family sabotage. Nathaniel Bradley was a celebrity wedding dress designer whose work had been featured on multiple reality television shows and whose gowns were worn by actresses, musicians, and socialites for their weddings. He had millions of followers on social media and was known not just for his extraordinary designs, but also for his generous spirit and his willingness to use his platform to highlight injustice and support people facing difficult situations. Nathaniel had been following my interior design work on social media for several months, appreciating my aesthetic and occasionally commenting on my projects with compliments and professional observations. When he saw Ashley's post about my destroyed wedding dress, he was apparently so outraged by the jealous sabotage that he made a decision that would change everything about my wedding crisis. At 9 o'clock that evening, Nathaniel posted on his own social media accounts, tagging both Ashley and me. His post included the photos of my destroyed dress, along with a message that immediately went viral among his millions of followers. I've been following Emily Thompson's interior design work for months and have always admired her aesthetic and professionalism, Nathaniel wrote. Today I learned that her custom wedding dress was destroyed by her jealous sister just days before her wedding, and that her mother defended this criminal act by blaming Emily for being too happy. I am disgusted by this family's toxic treatment of a talented woman whose only crime was being successful and excited about her wedding. But Nathaniel's post didn't stop with just expressing outrage. He continued with an offer that made me burst into tears when I read it. Emily, I would be honored to create your wedding dress. My team and I can design and complete a custom gown in 72 hours. There will be no charge. Your wedding will not be postponed because of your sister's jealous sabotage. You will walk down the aisle in a dress that celebrates your joy, rather than mourning the one destroyed by people who couldn't handle your happiness. Please direct message me so we can begin immediately. The post was seen by millions of people within hours. Nathaniel's followers flooded the comments with support for his offer, with anger about Lauren's behavior, with donations to my Venmo, even though Nathaniel was providing the dress for free. The story was picked up by wedding blogs, design websites, and eventually major news outlets, all framing it as a heartwarming tale of a celebrity designer stepping in to save a bride whose wedding was sabotaged by family jealousy. I direct messaged Nathaniel at 10 o'clock that evening, still crying, hardly able to believe that this was actually happening. Within minutes, he responded with his phone number and a request to schedule a video call for first thing the next morning to discuss my vision, take measurements, and begin the design process. The next morning, I had a 2-hour video consultation with Nathaniel and his design team. They asked detailed questions about my style preferences, my wedding venue and theme, the original dress design, what elements I'd loved most about Patricia's creation, and what I envisioned for my wedding day. Nathaniel's approach was both professional and compassionate, treating my loss of the original dress with appropriate gravity, while also focusing on creating something even more special for the replacement. "Emily," Nathaniel said during our consultation, "what your sister did was an act of jealous destruction that can't be undone. But what we're going to create together will be a dress that represents community support, creative collaboration, and the refusal to let toxic people destroy your joy. This dress will be about overcoming sabotage, not just replacing what was lost." Over the next 3 days, Nathaniel's team worked around the clock to create my wedding dress. They sent me regular updates with photos and videos of the work in progress, allowing me to provide feedback and approval at each stage. The dress they created was stunning beyond anything I could have imagined. A silk charmeuse gown with a fitted bodice, a dramatic full skirt, illusion lace sleeves with hand-beaded details, and a cathedral train that would photograph beautifully in the venue. But what made the dress truly extraordinary wasn't just its beauty. Nathaniel had incorporated subtle design elements that referenced the destroyed original dress, honoring Patricia's work while creating something entirely new. The botanical embroidery theme from my original gown was reimagined in the beadwork on the illusion sleeves. The color palette was expanded to include the sage green from my wedding theme, with delicate green beading throughout the bodice. The overall effect was a dress that acknowledged where I'd started while celebrating where I'd ended up through community support. Meanwhile, the social media response to my situation continued to grow. Ashley's original post and Nathaniel's offer had sparked a broader conversation about family jealousy, wedding sabotage, toxic dynamics, and how community support can replace family dysfunction. Thousands of people shared their own stories of relatives who had sabotaged important moments out of jealousy, of parents who defended destructive behavior, of choosing to distance themselves from toxic family members who couldn't celebrate their success. But the response went beyond just emotional support and viral attention. Multiple wedding vendors who saw the story reached out offering free services to help make my wedding special, despite the postponement and stress caused by Lauren's sabotage. A florist offered upgraded floral arrangements. A photographer offered extended coverage. A bakery offered a more elaborate cake than what Michael and I had originally ordered. A string quartet offered to play during the ceremony. Collectively, these vendors were contributing thousands of dollars worth of services because they were moved by the story and wanted to help create a beautiful wedding that overcame family toxicity. The overwhelming support from strangers who had no obligation to help me was both emotionally powerful and revealing about how much people respond to stories of overcoming sabotage through community rather than family support. I was receiving more kindness, generosity, and celebration from people I'd never met than I'd ever received from my mother or sister. And that contrast was both heartbreaking and liberating. But while I was experiencing this outpouring of community support, my family was experiencing the consequences of their actions becoming public knowledge, and their response to those consequences revealed everything about their priorities and their fundamental inability to accept accountability. The public response to Lauren's dress destruction and Barbara's defense of her behavior was swift, widespread, and overwhelmingly negative. Within 24 hours of Ashley's post going viral, both Lauren and Barbara were facing intense social consequences that they had never experienced before because I'd always protected them by keeping their dysfunction private. Friends and relatives who had witnessed years of Lauren's jealous behavior but had stayed silent out of family loyalty were now commenting on social media about other incidents they'd observed, creating a public record of Lauren's pattern of sabotage. Former classmates shared stories about Lauren's destructive reactions to other people's achievements. Family members posted about times when Barbara had blamed victims instead of holding Lauren accountable. The private family dysfunction that I'd been expected to hide was now becoming public knowledge, and the community judgment was harsh and unforgiving. Lauren's social media accounts were flooded with comments calling her jealous, destructive, criminal, and toxic. Strangers were messaging her demanding she apologize. suggesting she needed professional help, questioning how anyone could be so cruel as to destroy their sister's wedding dress. Her employer, a marketing firm where she worked as a junior account manager, received dozens of messages from people saying they would never do business with a company that employed someone who had admitted to criminal destruction of property out of jealousy. Barbara's accounts received similar treatment, with commenters expressing outrage that a mother would defend such destructive behavior and blame the victim for being too happy. People were sharing the post and adding their own commentary about toxic mothers who sacrifice one child to protect another, about enabling behavior that prevents growth and accountability, about how Barbara's response to the dress destruction explained why Lauren felt entitled to sabotage her sister's happiness. The negative attention was so intense and so widespread that within 48 hours, both Lauren and Barbara had deleted their social media accounts entirely, unable to handle the public condemnation of behavior they'd always been able to commit privately, without consequences. But deleting their accounts didn't stop the story from spreading or the judgment from intensifying. The narrative had taken on a life of its own, with wedding blogs writing articles about how to protect your dress from jealous relatives, family therapists using the story as an example of toxic dynamics and enabling behavior, and design websites celebrating Nathaniel's generous offer to help me, despite having no prior connection to my situation. My phone was ringing constantly with calls from relatives who had previously enabled Barbara and Lauren's behavior, but were now trying to distance themselves from the public backlash. Aunts who had told me to be more understanding of Lauren's jealousy were now claiming they'd always thought her behavior was problematic. Uncles who had suggested I was too sensitive about family conflicts were now saying they fully supported my decision to expose the dress destruction. Cousins who had witnessed Lauren's sabotage over the years were now offering testimonials about her pattern of destructive jealousy. The hypocrisy was stunning, but not surprising. These relatives had enabled the toxic dynamic when it was private and consequence-free, but now that it was public and reflecting badly on the entire family, they wanted to be seen as having always been on my side. I ignored most of their calls, having no interest in accepting their revisionist support after years of them contributing to the problem. Barbara called me repeatedly, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that revealed how shocked she was by the public consequences of behavior she'd been defending for decades. Her messages started with defensiveness, claiming I had betrayed the family by making private matters public, and that I was ruining Lauren's life by exposing what she'd done. But as the negative attention intensified and started affecting Barbara's own reputation and relationships, her messages became more desperate and manipulative. "Emily, you need to take down that post," one voicemail said. "People are saying terrible things about our family. Your sister might lose her job because of this. I might lose friends. You're destroying relationships over a dress. Yes, Lauren made a mistake, but you're making it so much worse by humiliating us publicly. Please, honey, make it stop. Tell people it was all a misunderstanding." The characterization of destroying my wedding dress as a mistake, and the suggestion that I was the one causing problems by exposing that mistake, was so typical of Barbara's approach to accountability that I almost laughed. She still couldn't admit that Lauren had done anything seriously wrong, and she still couldn't understand that the consequences Lauren and Barbara were facing were the natural result of their own actions becoming visible to people outside the family. I didn't respond to any of Barbara's messages or calls. I had said everything I needed to say when I'd tried to get her support, and she'd blamed me instead. Now I was focused on my wedding, on the extraordinary dress Nathaniel was creating, on the community of supporters who were celebrating my happiness instead of sabotaging it. Lauren's communications were different from Barbara's, but equally revealing. Instead of defensive voicemails, Lauren sent long text messages that alternated between fake apologies and continued blame shifting. One message would say, "I'm sorry for what I did to your dress. I wasn't thinking clearly." And the next would say, "But you have to understand how hard it's been watching you plan this perfect wedding while I'm still single and struggling." The inability to take full responsibility without immediately justifying her behavior showed that Lauren still didn't understand why what she'd done was so wrong. She viewed destroying my dress as a reasonable emotional response to her own feelings of inadequacy, and she expected me to accept her partial apologies because she'd added explanations about her difficult feelings. She still believed that her jealousy justified her destructive actions, and that I should be understanding rather than angry about having my wedding sabotaged. I blocked both Lauren and Barbara's numbers after the first few days of their attempts to contact me. I had no interest in continuing relationships with people who had shown me so clearly that they couldn't celebrate my happiness, support my important moments, or take accountability for their destructive behavior. The public exposure of their actions had accomplished what I'd hoped, creating consequences for behavior that my family had always protected them from experiencing. Have you ever felt more supported by strangers than by your own family, and realized that was actually a gift rather than a tragedy? On the morning of my rescheduled wedding day, which was exactly 1 week after Lauren had destroyed my original dress, I woke up feeling a mixture of emotions that were both complex and clear. There was grief for the family relationships that had been permanently damaged by Lauren's sabotage and Barbara's enabling. There was anger about decades of toxic dynamics that had finally reached a breaking point. But there was also profound gratitude for the community support that had emerged from exposing that toxicity, and genuine excitement about marrying Michael while wearing a dress created through generosity rather than purchased with my own money. Nathaniel had delivered the completed dress the previous evening, bringing it personally to Portland despite his busy schedule, because he wanted to ensure it fit perfectly and make any last-minute adjustments that might be needed. When I tried on the gown for the first time, both Nathaniel and I had tears in our eyes. The dress was absolutely stunning, even more beautiful than my original gown had been, representing not just his extraordinary talent, but also the community support that had made its creation possible. "Emily," Nathaniel said as I stood in front of the mirror wearing the completed gown, "this dress tells the story of refusing to let toxic people destroy your joy. When you walk down the aisle wearing it, everyone who knows what happened will see that you chose community over dysfunction, that you chose to celebrate your happiness instead of hiding it to manage someone else's jealousy. This dress is armor and beauty and strength all at once." The wedding ceremony was everything Michael and I had envisioned, made even more special by the knowledge that we were celebrating despite Lauren's attempt to sabotage our happiness. The venue was decorated exactly as I'd designed it, with the sage green, cream, and gold color scheme creating an elegant natural atmosphere. The 80 guests who attended were people who genuinely supported our marriage and celebrated our love, with no toxic family members present to create drama or conflict. As I walked down the aisle wearing the extraordinary dress Nathaniel had created in 72 hours, I could see tears in the eyes of guests who knew the full story of what had happened. They weren't crying because they felt sorry for me. They were crying because the dress represented something bigger than just replacement clothing. It represented community triumphing over toxicity, generosity overcoming sabotage, and the refusal to let jealous people destroy important moments. Michael's face when he saw me in the dress was worth every moment of stress and crisis from the previous week. His expression showed love, pride, admiration, and profound gratitude that despite everything my family had done to try to sabotage our wedding, we were still getting married surrounded by people who actually supported our happiness. The ceremony itself was intimate and meaningful, with vows we'd written ourselves that referenced both the challenges we'd overcome and the future we were building together. When the officiant pronounced us married and Michael kissed me, the applause from our guests felt like celebration not just of our marriage, but of everything we'd survived to get to that moment. But what made the reception truly extraordinary was the awareness among our guests that they were participating in something special. The vendors who had donated upgraded services had created a celebration far more elaborate than what Michael and I had originally planned. The photographer who had offered extended coverage was documenting every detail, knowing that the photos would become part of the larger story about overcoming family sabotage through community support. During the reception, Ashley gave a speech that brought the entire room to tears. She talked about our friendship, about the original dress destruction, about Nathaniel's generous offer, about the community response, and about how proud she was that I'd chosen to expose the toxicity rather than hide it as I'd done for 30 years. Emily has spent her entire life being told to make herself smaller so her sister could feel bigger, Ashley said during her speech. She's been blamed for Lauren's jealous reactions to her success. She's been expected to hide her achievements to manage someone else's inadequacy. But when Lauren destroyed her wedding dress and their mother defended that destruction, Emily made a different choice. She chose exposure over protection. She chose community over dysfunction. She chose to let the world see what she'd been hiding for decades. And look what happened when she made that choice. Ashley gestured around the reception, at the beautiful space, the extraordinary dress I was wearing, the guests who were genuinely celebrating rather than creating drama. Emily received more support from strangers than she ever received from her own mother or sister. A celebrity designer created her dress for free. Vendors donated thousands of dollars of services. Thousands of people shared her story and sent messages of encouragement. All because she stopped protecting people who refused to protect her. The speech was both celebration and validation, acknowledging that what had happened was terrible, while also celebrating the extraordinary community response it had generated. Every word Ashley spoke was true, and hearing it articulated so clearly in front of people who knew our family dynamics was both painful and liberating. The reception continued late into the evening, with dancing, laughter, and joy that felt untainted by the jealousy and toxicity that had characterized so many family events throughout my life. Michael and I were surrounded by people who wanted us to be happy, who celebrated our success rather than resenting it, who supported our choices rather than sabotaging them. In the weeks following the wedding, the story continued to resonate across social media and wedding communities. Nathaniel posted photos of me in the dress he'd created, along with the backstory of why he'd made it and what it represented about overcoming family sabotage. The post received millions of views and tens of thousands of comments from people sharing their own stories about toxic family members and the importance of choosing your own happiness over managing other people's jealousy. Several media outlets requested interviews about the situation, wanting to discuss family dynamics, wedding planning, dealing with jealous relatives, and the community response that had emerged from making private dysfunction public. I agreed to some of these interviews, using them as opportunities to talk about the patterns of behavior that had led to the dress destruction and the enabling that had allowed those patterns to continue for decades. During one particularly meaningful interview with a family therapist who had written articles about toxic family dynamics, I talked about the years of being told my success was something to hide rather than celebrate. I described Barbara's consistent victim blaming whenever Lauren sabotaged something important to me. I explained how exposure had created consequences that my family had always protected Lauren from experiencing. What you did by making Lauren's behavior public was refuse to participate in the family's dysfunctional system anymore, the therapist said during our conversation. For 30 years, your role was to absorb Lauren's jealous destruction quietly to preserve everyone else's comfort. By choosing exposure over protection, you disrupted that system and allowed natural consequences to finally reach the people whose behavior had been protected. That's not revenge, that's accountability. The interview was viewed by hundreds of thousands of people and shared widely among communities focused on family dysfunction, recovery from toxic relationships, and establishing boundaries with relatives who refuse to change their destructive patterns. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome from the entire situation was the private messages I received from other people who had experienced similar family dynamics. Hundreds of people reached out to share their own stories about siblings who sabotaged important moments out of jealousy, parents who defended destructive behavior, families that expected them to manage other people's emotions by diminishing their own success. Many of these messages came from people who said that seeing my story had given them permission to stop hiding their own family dysfunction, to establish boundaries they'd been afraid to set, to choose their own happiness over protecting relatives who didn't protect them. The ripple effect of my decision to expose Lauren's behavior was helping other people recognize and address similar patterns in their own families. 6 months after my wedding, I was still receiving messages from people thanking me for sharing my story. The dress that Nathaniel had created was featured in a wedding magazine article about overcoming adversity. My interior design business had received positive attention from the story, with potential clients reaching out specifically because they'd seen how I'd handled the family crisis with dignity and strength. But the most significant change was internal. I was no longer carrying the burden of protecting people who had hurt me repeatedly. I was no longer managing my success to prevent Lauren's jealous reactions, or accepting blame for Barbara's enabling of her destructive behavior. I had established clear boundaries with family members who couldn't celebrate my happiness, and I had built a life surrounded by people who actually supported me, rather than sabotaged me. Lauren and Barbara were permanently excluded from my life after their actions brought them public shame and consequences they'd avoided for decades. I heard through relatives that Lauren had eventually lost her job after her employer decided that employing someone who had admitted to criminal destruction of property was bad for their company image. I heard that Barbara had lost several friendships after people understood the extent of her enabling behavior. These were natural consequences of their own actions, not punishments I had imposed, and I felt no guilt about the difficulties they were experiencing. The relationship between Michael and me had grown even stronger through the crisis, with him demonstrating consistent support and partnership during one of the most difficult periods of my life. He had never suggested that I should hide what Lauren did or protect my family from consequences. He had celebrated when Nathaniel offered to create my dress, had been proud when I chose exposure over protection, and had married me with full awareness that I was choosing him and our future over toxic family dynamics that would never change. If you're reading this and you're dealing with family members who sabotage important moments out of jealousy, while other relatives defend their destructive behavior, please know that you have options beyond continuing to absorb abuse quietly to maintain everyone else's comfort. Exposure can bring consequences that enablers refuse to impose, and community support often emerges when people understand what you've been dealing with privately. Setting boundaries with toxic family members isn't cruel. It's necessary for protecting yourself from people who have shown you repeatedly that they can't celebrate your success or support your happiness. The guilt you might feel about exposing their behavior is less important than the freedom that comes from no longer hiding dysfunction to protect people who refuse to protect you. And if you're planning a wedding while dealing with jealous relatives, please consider what legal and practical protections you can put in place to prevent sabotage. Give your dress to a trusted friend for safekeeping. Don't share details about vendors or venues with people who might try to create problems. Build a community of support from people who actually celebrate your happiness rather than resent it. The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries and celebrate your achievements. The people who view your success as a threat to their ego will reveal themselves through their objections to your happiness and their attempts to sabotage your important moments. Trust your instincts about which category your family members fall into, and don't let guilt prevent you from protecting yourself from people who have shown you who they really are. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had to expose family dysfunction to finally get consequences for destructive behavior? How did you handle situations where relatives sabotaged important moments and other family members defended them? Your story might help someone else who's struggling with similar family dynamics. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember that sometimes the best response to family sabotage is refusing to let them destroy your joy and letting the world see what you've been hiding. See you in our next story here on Her Sweet Revenge.